Hi there, and welcome back to the Energy Sector Heroes podcast. My name is Michelle Fraser, and every week I will speak with incredible people who share their lessons, experiences, and stories from their time spent in the energy sector. Hi there, and welcome back again to this week's episode. If you're new to the show, then please take a second to subscribe and even consider sharing the show with just one other person. This week I am joined by Bradley Wamboldt. Bradley is an incredible principal associate with over 30 years experience in the energy sector. Bradley, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, and thank you for inviting me to your podcast today. I really admire your work and what it is you're trying to do here. So, yeah, my name's Bradley Wamboldt. I'm a principal associate with my own consultancy called Hawk and Squirrel Innovations. I started that about a year ago after 19 years with Suncor Energy in Canada, as well as 14 years before that with Shell Canada. So yeah, 33 plus years with oil and gas companies out of Calgary, Alberta, and Canada in a variety of roles. I've worked initially as an engineer and eventually moved into operations roles. I've done functional roles in supply chain. And all throughout my career, I really had unique and great opportunities to work on technology developments. So when I was with Shell, I worked on a technology called paraffinic froth treatment, kind of an esoteric technology unique to the oil sands in northern Alberta, but it was a real game-changing technology where I had the opportunity to work right from test tubes, literally test tubes in the lab, in Shell's research lab, through to pilot plants. Worked as the lead process engineer on the design of that facility, gone later to actually be the first operating superintendent of the commercial plant. So all the way from test tubes to full commercial operation. With Suncor, did a similar thing with a tailings technology, a game-changing tailings technology that eliminated the need for tailings ponds in the oil sands business. Again, taking that from test tubes through to full commercial operation. In supply chain, did a number of kind of enterprise-wide digital innovations around buying, etc. So, fairly standard roles, but at the same time, roles where I had the opportunity to do a lot of innovation internally. We call it intrapreneurship as opposed to entrepreneurship, where you're able to do these kinds of things with the resources available to you from the larger operating company. My last job with Suncor, I led a group called Enterprise Technology. This was a corporate level disruptive technology development group, basically asked for by our board of directors to say, look, we see a lot of technology out in the world, and we want to understand how we can participate in that. So I had the opportunity to stand up a group from scratch to look at these energy transition type technologies. So we looked at everything from carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and use. We looked at all the various types of clean hydrogen. We looked at small modular nuclear reactors. We looked at nuclear fusion. We looked at renewable liquid fuels. So essentially, carbon transition technologies adjacent to what happens in an oil and gas company, so hydrocarbon manipulation and distribution, not so much in the electrification or solar and wind or other better people working on that type of stuff, but there's a lot of technology adjacent to the skill set that you see in oil and gas that can make a real difference in our energy transition and our goals to net zero. So I stood up that group, ran that group for 5 or 6 years until my retirement from Suncor last year. And now with my consultancy, Hawk and Squirrel, I continue to work in that space between the startup companies and the actual deployment of commercial technology. So there's a sequence of events from the lab through to engineering design, through to startups, marketing their engineering design, through to consolidating those into investable projects through to actually building and operating these, typically very capital intense projects. And I believe there's a little bit of a weak spot between, your entrepreneurs with a good, solid engineering design and a good product to sell, and the $200, $300, $500 million project that would incorporate that. The people that know how to build mega projects are on a different wavelength than the people that have developed new technologies. So I've positioned my current role, my current consultancy, to kind of bridge the gap, because that's what I was doing. That's what my team was doing inside of Suncor, was understanding how we could take those technologies and actually deploy them into existing infrastructure, or more often than not, into new value chains. And how can you participate in new value chains? So can't step away from it. Yeah, I'm sure I'm retired, but there's no way I'm leaving the industry right now, and certainly not leaving this very exciting space at this very exciting time. Sorry for the long interview, or for the long introduction, but yeah, that's me.
No, that sounds amazing. So how did you get started off in the energy sector?
Yeah, so it was not particularly magical. I graduated as a chemical engineer from McGill University. A bunch of recruiters came to town, and the best offer I could see was from Shell at the time, Shell Canada. So I packed my bags and moved to Alberta, and I've been here since then, since 1989. So it really was just. My father also worked in the oil and gas business, and he also coincidentally worked for Shell. And I did see the security, right, at that time, of working in a large company with the resources. And as I said earlier, you can approach innovation from a couple of angles. As a startup, you've got a lot of freedom. You're not dealing with bureaucracy, et cetera, but you have no resources, right? And it's kind of the flip side to be able to work within a large organization where, sure, there are processes and bureaucracy and whatnot, but much better access to resources. So if you can decipher how to work within that system, you're not worried about resources in the same way that startups, who have this great idea and unlimited flexibility, but no way to actually implement. So, I found that as an interesting. Working within a large company has its pros and cons, and I just kind of stayed with it.
Okay, so what is the pros and cons of working in a large company?
Yeah, well, as I said, I mean the pros are unlimited resources, almost unlimited resources, although that's not quite true. Of course, they are closely sort of monitored. The other thing is the training. I mean, Shell has an incredible post-graduation training program for hires. So one of the first things I did with them, just as a junior engineer, so keep in mind I'm in Canada, so going to The Hague is a big deal. So all the way to The Hague in the Netherlands for 5 weeks of technical training, right? So it's like you're beyond your university education, you get even more technical training, and that was the shortened course, right? Most expats do sort of a 5-month program. So the training was incredible. The skill sets you're surrounded with, like the experience and the people that are within these companies, have tremendous skill, tremendous things to offer in terms of their skills and advice and mentorship. So those are some of the pros. The cons are predictable. Anytime you gather tens of thousands of people together, there need to be systems and processes and forms and things of that nature. And you do need to learn to work within those systems, understand how decisions get made, really, build out your network so that you can have some influence. And that can take some time. I guess it's a con that comes with your access to funds.
Okay. That's interesting. That leads me on to the next question. So who was your mentor? Did you have one during your career?
Yeah, no, I knew you were going to ask me that. And, to be totally honest, if I was to go back into my career, I would have spent a lot more time developing mentors, that like more deliberately developing mentors and more deliberately developing a network of senior leaders. I think, when you start in a company, you're nervous, right? You believe you need to know everything, that there's a little bit of imposter syndrome going on. Like, I can't believe they hired me to do this. Like, really? Don't they know who I am? So you're nervous to approach senior leaders. As I progressed in my career, I came to understand that actually they love it, right? If you just call them up and say, hey, I'm really interested in this area and what you do. Can I buy a cup of coffee? Can we set up a kind of regular cadence? Because I really think I can learn from you. I wish I had done more of that. Having said that, I had really good go-bys over the years. People that you could watch and eventually build a relationship. I remember working with, I should say, a fellow in a very similar position to where I am now, where he had worked many years in a large company, was now doing some more technical consulting, but looking at that approach, the approach of how do you take some of these very complex technical puzzles and be able to translate them in such a way that various other groups can understand. In other words, as we talk about energy transition, as we talk about our goal of net zero, it's actually an incredibly complex balance between energy security and energy sustainability, between emissions and between having enough energy to sustain our society. And a lot of those complexities are technical in nature. So you need a strong technical background, which this individual had, like doctor of engineering, PhD, but at the same time had the ability to communicate with operators, be able to communicate with executives, be able to communicate with project people, be able to communicate with finance people, because all of those groups need to be brought together to actually bring something new into being, and they don't necessarily communicate well together. So, I think that was kind of the biggest influence on what I'm doing today, which is largely a translating role, right? Being able to go to a research university in the morning, talk about thermodynamics or whatever, and then do a presentation in the afternoon to the executive table in such a way that it makes sense to both, right? Be able to talk to an operator who's describing the challenge that they're having and understanding that that's actually related to the very technical discussion you were having in the morning at the university, and being able to describe it and work with the operators. So I think one of my best mentors did that incredibly well, could sit in many different environments and be able to translate between the two. And largely that is, my definition of engineering, right? Translating science into technology, translating fundamentals into usable artifacts that make a difference to our society.
Okay. No, excellent. So what is the most challenging thing about your current role, and how do you handle it?
Yeah, so the most challenging thing about my current role is kind of the reason why I've set up my consultancy, and that is this gap between, and I guess there's a certain frustration level in all of these great technologies that are being developed, and all of the resources going into creating new startup companies and new technologies, and you see them all there, but then nothing gets built. I shouldn't say nothing, but you just don't see the level of deployment that we're actually going to need to get to some of the targets that we set for ourselves. And, that gap is like, oh, that's the space, I want to work to make that connection. So, the difficulty is getting those groups to understand each other, not in a positive way, right? I mean, you will talk to small startups, they'll say, oh, good gracious, these large companies, they're so difficult to deal with. They're so bureaucratic. They're so risk averse. Like, they're never going to do this. They're never going to do that, right? Mm-hmm. And then you'll talk to large companies that go, that's never going to work. They don't understand, how we actually need to do things, finance, the real world. They're dreaming, right? And bringing those together, saying to the small companies, well, I mean, you can sit and complain about how risk averse these companies are, or you can just recognize that's the way it is, right? If I often say, like, if you're going to ask anybody to spend, I don't know, $500 million in the commercial manifestation of your idea, if you don't think they're going to have some questions, right, you're kind of kidding yourself. That's a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
And on the flip side, you have no idea how to efficiently and effectively spend and build a $500 million project. That is a skill set all on its own. And you're going to need that skill set. So you're going to have to learn how to bring your idea to such a point that it's understandable by the people that know how to actually make it a reality. Don't complain about it. Understand it, right? Understand what do they need. So imagine, okay, so you have a new hydrogen technology. That's great. Looks like it works, quote unquote, whatever works mean. Looks like it's economic. Looks like you could build a reasonable size unit. If that's going to actually get built, you need to one day sit in a room with people that are allocating capital and talk their language. You're going to need to be able to say, we've de-risked this technology from a technical perspective to a reasonable level. It won't be zero because it's first of a kind, but to a reasonable level, and we can demonstrate that. We understand how much it's really going to cost. We've had a professional organization come in, an engineering firm, and do a real cost estimate that you're going to believe, because you're not going to believe my cost estimate, right? You're going to need a third-party cost estimate. You've run the economics. You've run the sensitivities. You see, you're now speaking their language. They're not interested in how excited you are about your technology. They're interested in whether that project holds up against all the other projects they have on their list that day. So if you can learn to do that, right? If you can learn to speak their language as opposed to trying to convince them to speak your language, you're going to have much more success, right? And then at the same time, what can you do with large companies to essentially describe to them that there is this, I believe there's this missing or this unrecognized function. And I use the word function very deliberately because I used to work in a function in supply chain at one point in my career. If you think of a function as a composite of unique and specific processes, tools, and skill sets, right? Like you don't run a supply chain organization the same way with the same people as you do an HR organization, right? Or even an operation. So when I say function, there's this missing function, I believe, in this techno-commercial space, in this translation of new technology opportunities into investable projects. So if you can start to describe that to the companies that, you really need to recognize that there is a process before this. Companies are process driven, right? They're all this process links into that process, and supply chain links into finance, which links into operations, et cetera. So if you can start to describe to them, look, there is a process here that's going unrecognized. And if you can understand that these technologies that are sitting out there, if they work their way through that process, will link to your processes, will link to your capital allocation processes, will link to your project execution processes. And you can have a better conversation between these great ideas and actually getting steel on the ground. I forget the question you asked. You got me on my soapbox, and I just keep going and going.
No, but I can't interrupt you because your information is so valuable, actually.
Thank you.
If you were going to hire someone, what would make a great hire, in your opinion?
Yeah, so hiring is an interesting one, and at the end of the day, it comes down to fit, right? Like, how well does a person fit in a particular role? I mean, I've sadly had to, throughout my career, terminate a number of people. And it's not typically because they're bad people, it's because they don't fit in the role. So insofar as your question would be about if I was to hire somebody into this innovation space, either entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship, to me, the key aspect would be willingness to learn, to continue to learn, to understand it's lifelong learning. It's not about getting your degree in high school and then or in university and then just, milking that for the rest of your career. One of the best hires I did, and she may at some point be listening to this and she'll know who she is, but one of the best hires we ever had was probably a little low on the experience scale. Like you reading the resume, you'd go, I'm not sure, right? Like this is some pretty advanced work fairly early in her career. She came into the interview and said, look, I don't have much. We were hiring her into a biofuels space. She said, I really don't have much experience in biofuels. So in preparation for this interview, I took a course, and I actually have some questions and ideas about biofuels and how they might work and how we might make them better, right? So to me, that was like, okay, so right there, this is an individual that wasn't going to come in and tell me why she was so good for the role, that actually said, I'm willing to learn, right? And she turned out to be an outstanding hire into our technology development group, because it is all about learning. And particularly in this space, I've been thinking a little bit about this. It's like, where are the Renaissance people, right? Where are the Leonardo da Vinci's that could do this and do that and think this way and think that way? You really need a lot of that in that space, which requires you to be humble about what you already know, and willing to go out and learn, and then willing to make those connections. So that's what I look for people working in this space, is that humbleness, that willingness to learn, and also some comfort with ambiguity, right? Like the job you sign up for may evolve into something different. We don't know how to solve some of this stuff. You need to be comfortable with that. I mean, one reason I really resonate with this type of work is, notwithstanding I worked within very structured companies for many years. I think I was up to about 18 unique jobs that I had within my career. And all but two of those, in all but two of those cases, there was no incumbent. I was the first person to do that role, right? If you think about, all that work in technology, well, we were building not just the technology, we were building a new business unit within the company. So, you're the first person. No one's ever done process engineering on this before. No one's ever been the operations superintendent in this plant before. Even supply chain was going through a consolidation, so that role was new. It wasn't like I was stepping into somebody's shoes and just, following orders. It was like, okay, we have to reinvent this group. We have to think about how we're going to structure it and hire for it. And then obviously my last role with enterprise technology, we were standing up a new team. So I have a high degree of tolerance for ambiguity, and that has served me well, because those are the roles that I seek, and that's what I would look for in a new hire, particularly in this space. I had a conversation once with a senior executive about next steps in my career. What do you want to do next? What's your next role going to be? Because you've been doing this supply chain role for a while. And I said, well, I'm not going to fall for that. That's a trick question. He says, well, what do you mean? I said, well, you can't really tell me how we're even going to be organized in 6 months, because we're always doing reorganization. So how am I supposed to pick a job when I don't even know what the landscape's going to be? So what I do is I say, look, two things. What are my strengths, and what do I look for in a job? Right. So when you come to me with a proposal for my next role, here's what I'm looking for, right? And my particular ones, and they're different for everybody. My particular ones were, I want to go somewhere where I have impact and influence, and that's not necessarily linked to job level, right? There are some people in VP and EVP roles. They'd be roles I wouldn't take in 100 years, because I'd rather stick pins in my eyes than sit there and do the same thing day in and day out like we've done for 20 years, right? So influence and impact. I said, look, I'm comfortable with ambiguity. I'm comfortable with standing new things up. And then as my throwaway comment as I walked out the door was, and if you ever decide to do technology in a sensible way in this company, let me know, because I got some ideas. And then 3 months later, they come back to me and say, okay, well, actually, the board would like to do something in the technology space. And it's new, and, it's going to have a lot of impact and influence. So how about it? And I said, yeah, that totally lines up, right? Lines up with my strengths, lines up with what I want to do with my career. And, if I had advice for people, switching your question around to what would I hire, an interview is a two-way street. So the interviewee is also looking, do I want this job? The two things I've always asked my people to think about is think about where do you want to end your career? Like, it might be early, but think about your North Star. When you get to retirement, you want to look back on your career and say, that was fantastic because ... And that answer is different for everybody. I had a great career because I got to the top. I had a great career because I became a technical expert in a place. I had a great career because I mentored dozens of people and helped the new generation come in. I had a great career because whatever, right? So think about what it is you're trying to achieve with your career. And does this job get you closer or further away from that? And then does it play to your strengths? It's super important to understand what kind of innate strengths you have. And these are not things, like I do a good presentation or I do a good this, but some deep strengths that are kind of that can be universally deployed in different types of careers, because that's what differentiates you. The strengths differentiate you. Your development when you first join a company is going to be all about closing gaps and getting to a particular level of proficiency. But once you're okay at everything, you want to get super good at your strengths rather than continuing to work at the worst thing, the thing that you're least good at, because that just leads to mediocrity. You want to be recognized and continue to hone your strengths rather than just continue to work on your weaknesses. Again, I forgot the question and you had me rambling on.
No, it was about how yeah, no, I was so interested about listening to you, because I was going to ask you, do you think it's easier to carve out a career for yourself as a technical expert in a larger company than it is in a smaller company?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I've never really considered myself a technical expert. I mean, I'm a chemical engineer with an MBA. And, I built my whole, my career around, I had an executive MBA. I got my MBA late, but, I built my later career around connecting those dots, being able to explain engineering to business people and business to technical people. So as to whether that's easier in a large company or a small company, I'm not sure. I think again, the distinguishing factors between those two environments, one is ultimate flexibility, generalist, I do everything, but I have no resources, or I have to find and dig and scratch for resources, versus working in a more structured environment where my role is more clear, but it's also more constrained. But there are resources available if I can figure out how to unlock them. So I think they're just different environments. A technical expert, a straight up technical expert out of school to develop new skills, probably easier to start in a larger company where you're surrounded by, experienced people, where you have access to training, etc. That might be the place to get started on the technical side. But on the other side, if you want to get into some of this more connection, you can do that from either end. Okay.
Because I was just wondering, because you've worked in quite a few amazing companies, large companies, do you think it's more beneficial for a graduate to come out of university and try and go and work in their dream organization, rather than maybe go to a different company that maybe have a really good training scheme and they could learn more about their trade and then maybe work up to becoming an employee in their dream company?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough choice, right? And
because it's hard to know what to do when you leave university. Because you might have this dream to go and work in Shell or BP or whoever it is, but then so does everybody else.
Yeah, well, so keep in mind, I came to my career at a very interesting time. I came to my career at the end of, what you might think of as the Iron Rice Bowl, right? Where you join a company, you're there for life. Like my father, he worked for one company for 36 years and never even thought about leaving, never even thought about, like he said, you really couldn't, right? Like it just didn't work that way. I caught the tail end of that and worked through this transition where it became much more transactional to work with any organization. Pensions changed, the layoffs, things of that nature made it so there was quite a bit of transition over the course of a transition in the relationship between the employee and the employer over time. So early on in my career, one of my more business-minded mentors recommended me a book called A Company of One. I don't even know if they still print it. It's a very thin little book, and it has kind of the very straightforward concept that, you are a company of one. At the end of the day, Bradley Wamboldt is the entity that I need to be looking out for. Now, I will have employment relationships along the way with various other organizations. And if I have a contract, if you think of it more like my company, I'm contracting my services to this large company, there needs to be a quid pro quo, right? Like I will work, it's not like I'm independent to the point that I work against the company, but because when I'm in there, you have me, right? But at the same time, you do kind of need to look after your own development and your own company of one. So if you were to get to a decision as you described, I would say, okay, well, what makes the most sense for me, for my company of one? This is going to be a back and forth. What am I hoping to get out of this relationship, right? They don't own you. It's a business relationship. So you work for them for money and for other things. So I think those are all very, discrete and specific decisions as to where you are in your career at the minute, which is why it's so important to have that North Star, right? Because if you're a company of one with an objective, right? I want to achieve this with my career, with my company of one. And I'm presented with this option, right? Do I do a dream job right away, or do I go try to get some training? You need to make the assessment, which is going to, in the long run, get me closer to that goal. If I don't have the skills, maybe I do need to, for a time, learn about that. Learn the inner workings of a big company, because someday when I have my dream job and I'm on the outside, or I'm an entrepreneur, that's good to know. It's good to know how big companies work, right? And how to be able to interact with them. So you really need to make that, you end up where you end up based on innumerable small decisions you make along the way. The famous expression that you can't change the weather, all you can do is adjust your sails, right? So the weather is the weather, the decision is the decision. How are you going to adjust your sails so that you keep going in the direction that you want and don't just go in circles? So I don't have a good answer for your question other than to say, keep your eye on where it is you're trying to go and try to make the decisions that get you closer to your goal, not further away.
No, I think that was a really good answer, actually. Thank you. So I just wondered, have you had any career disasters, and how have you handled them?
Yeah. So interestingly, I'm not sure it was a career disaster, exactly what you mean by that, but I did have a rather startling situation when I was frost treatment superintendent, the first one. Shortly after we started up the facility, we had a very major fire. So, the call at 3:15 in the morning, the unit is on fire. We've got 11-meter flames. Not everybody's been accounted for yet. That certainly was a dramatic point in my career that perhaps could have been disastrous, because at the end of the day, I'm responsible for what happens. And we've had a major incident. By the way, everybody was safely accounted for at the end of the day. So there were no serious injuries at all, but considerable damage and 6 months downtime before we could get some of these facilities rebuilt and started up. So obviously all eyes were kind of on me and my team at that point. And I guess, what was important at that point, and how getting through that, you learn a lot about leadership. Okay, everybody's looking to you to see how you're going to react. Everybody's, taking their cues from your attitude to this. So we just had to take a very pragmatic attitude in a very difficult environment. When you start to get major insurance companies involved, they're not much interested in this no fault, just learn from it kind of thing. They want to figure out whose fault it was, right? And, how you handle that, like you're looking for people to throw under the bus, or you're trying to deflect or whatever. I mean, they're going to take your cues from you. And we took a very pragmatic approach. We obviously opened everything up. We talked about the systems and the processes and where things broke down. And by being able to describe, the mitigations we had in place, just really settle things down on that front. It's like, okay, we see that you had everything together. There were a number of factors that kind of lined up to make this thing happen. It's more of an unfortunate exercise rather than anybody's at fault. So turning that from a who's at fault to how can we systemically understand what happened and make sure it doesn't happen again, in a very challenging and stressful situation, I'd say was probably one of my most dramatic and impactful parts of my career. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
And you learn from it, right? You learn from it that number one, the most important thing was everybody safe, right? And once you've established that, the rest is somewhat more academic, right? Like I do not want to be in a situation where I'm knocking on somebody's door to explain why somebody didn't come home. And then being able to describe how important that was to the team. And now we're just doing a thing. Right now we were fortunate that didn't happen. So now let's just get to work, figure out what happened, try to get some of the rhetoric and excitement out of this, and just calmly go through our work and describe how we can avoid this in the future.
Okay. So I've got one maybe final question for you. If you could turn back time, would you change anything?
I've had a fantastic career, and it's still going, right? So I'm I always did, my North Star, I always wanted to end up in this space. I imagine myself doing this kind of consulting work, just to be able to manage my own time and work on things that are of interest only to me, a little less worry about the cash flow. But if I was to change one thing, it was something I mentioned earlier. I would have spent more time on my network, particularly, moving companies. You got to reestablish networks, people that were your mentors and sponsors, et cetera, within a large company. They retire, they move on, and it's a very fluid environment. So, and I think I might even have learned more faster if I had just overcome that essentially shyness of going up. And it's not, I'm not talking about schmoozing, right? I'm not talking about, at the company Christmas or holiday party, going, hey, it's me and I'm great. It's more about if there's an area in the company that you think you might be interested in, if there's a leader that you say, I really like how they operate, respectfully and humbly go up and say, look, I'm really interested in what you do and how you do it. And if you're amenable, I'd really appreciate having some of your time just to understand and talk about, what your group does, if that's what you're interested, how you got to where you are. And I think people would be surprised at how easy that is in the end, and how often the senior leader would actually appreciate that too, because they want to describe what they've learned, and they also learn a lot from you, right? They learn a lot about, well, what's really going on now, because the organization is constantly changing. And when they were in that role, it was a different world. So it does end up being a two-way street. And had I done more of that, I think I could have, as I said, learned more faster, and that would have been a better thing.
I think so too. I think it's really important to have to seek out good mentors.
Yeah, and don't be shy. Like people know where you are in your career. They're not expecting you to have all the answers, and And, as I said in answer to one of your questions, one of the things I admire most is an openness to learning. And if you're approaching this as a learning opportunity, I think you find leaders will be impressed by that as well.
I think so too. So that's all the questions I have today. I would like to thank Bradley for your time. That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
Thank you, Michelle. I really enjoyed our discussion.
That brings us to the end of another episode. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, I'd like to gently encourage you to leave a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts and share the show with another person. You can also follow me on LinkedIn or via my website, www.michellefraserconsultancy.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.